Today I'm speaking with Bill Darlison. Bill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, Tim.
Thank you so much. We wanted to give everyone a brief introduction. For anyone who doesn't know Bill, he was the minister, excuse me, Bill was the minister emeritus of Dublin Unitarian Church. And do you still work with that church, by the way?
Well, I live in England now, so
okay.
But I do go to Ireland when it's possible.
Okay.
A couple of times a year, and I will take services there when I do, occasionally, you know.
Okay.
But for the most part, no, it has another minister now, and I'm in the background.
Gotcha. And I do want to ask you more about that church in just a minute, but just to give everyone more of a background, you went to York St. John University, and then the I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Pontificio Collegio Beta in Rome. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you had an honorary degree in philosophy. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you also got a master's in religion from the University of Hull. And then after that, again, you were went into Unitarianism, and you got a ministerial diploma in religion and theology from the Unitarian College of Manchester. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of education. I wanted to ask, before I go on with the bio, how long were you in Rome, and what was that like? That must have been incredible.
I was 2.5 years in Rome, from September 1971 till January 1974. So it was about 2.5 years. Did
you get to the Vatican much?
I went there occasionally, but it was never my thing.
Okay.
Really, I loved that time. I mean, really, I would not trade that period of time in Rome for anything. It was because, to have time to yourself to study in one of the most beautiful cities on earth is really priceless. And I met some wonderful people and had some good teachers. And, the Catholic Church, I have no animosity towards at all. I had to leave being an official spokesperson, or being on the way to becoming an official spokesperson, because I felt it was a role I couldn't really fulfill. I didn't want to be a priest in a parish and tell people not to use birth control. And then to have the local papers asking me about the latest papal announcement and so on. I didn't want to be defending those kind of things. But
sure.
there are some wonderful aspects to Catholicism, which, and another thing really, Tim, like the Jews, the Catholics are not opposed to astrology. Now, mainly the antagonism towards astrology and astrology in religion comes from Protestants.
Yeah.
It does not come from Jews. I mean, I just happen to have a couple of books here which are on the side. One is the Astrological Secrets of the Hebrew Sages, which I got 30 years ago by Rabbi Dobian. And here's another one, Above the Zodiac, which is a Jewish publication. And Catholics too understand symbolism in a way that your more literal Protestant tends not to.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in astrology from the mid-60s, really. And when I went to Rome, people found it perhaps rather strange, but they weren't hostile to it. And they wanted to find out more about it. Entering Unitarianism, which prides itself on being open-minded, I found real hostility. And so, it is a curious kind of, it is. So my time in Rome was a great time. And I left and went back into teaching in a Catholic school, and gradually drifted into Unitarianism because even though I wasn't a priest, I still felt called to ministry. And I didn't want to go into the Methodists or the Anglicans. Unitarianism seemed the appropriate one for me. So that's how I kind of drifted into it, and eventually found myself in Dublin, where I was for 14 years. I mean, really, the center of Catholicism in many ways, and yet it was this little Unitarian enclave in a beautiful church in the center of the city. And that was another first-class experience for me, really.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I want to ask you about the Unitarian Church in just a second. Just to give everyone a final part of the bio, I want to go over some of the books that Bill Darlison has written. The one that we're going to probably be digging into the most is called The Gospel and the Zodiac. But you did have some other books here that are fascinating. I love even some of the names of these, if I'm getting these right. Enlightenment and Ice Cream.
These are collections of sermons, really, Tim. You know,
that's awesome.
The name of the book is really taken from one of the sermons that is in the book. You know,
I love it. Just read through this. The Penultimate Truth and Other Incitements. The Shortest Distance. Those are stories from the world's spiritual traditions. Concentration and Compassion. More stories from the world's spiritual traditions. Unitarian Weddings in Dublin. That sounds fascinating. Spirituality and the Four Elements. That really intrigues me. I'll have to pick that one up. The Shortest Distance. 101 Stories from the World's Spiritual Traditions. Fred Sedgwick's Cat. That sounds interesting. The Odds on God. Sermons from 2002 and 2003. And then you had one more book about, is it Moses, correct? One more.
Yes. Moses the Matador, it's called.
Yes.
It is astrotheology.
Is it just that one and the Gospel and the Zodiac that are astrotheology, or are there any others? Okay.
No, just those two. Oh, well, there is another. When I was in Dublin, when the Gospel and the Zodiac came out in 2007, I decided, because I knew that people would become aware that this was available, that the people in the congregation would need to know what it was about. So I decided that I would give a sermon every month, that I would do 2 sermons per month throughout the year, looking at the way in which Mark's gospel reflects the particular zodiac signs that the sun goes through in the course of a year from March to March. And so I put those together in a book which I called The Celestial Journey of the Soul. Now, Duckworth, who published the Zodiac, the Gospel and the Zodiac, they wouldn't allow that to be published because it covered the same ground. So I kind of waited until the Gospel and the Zodiac went out of print, and then I've published The Celestial Journey of the Soul now. It covers the same ground, but it's really more accessible than the Gospel and the Zodiac, you know, because if you're standing in a pulpit with no visual aids, you have to make yourself understood. And so it is really quite a simplified version. And in one sense, it's preferable really, because you don't get bogged down in it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's awesome. I want to dive into that in just a minute. I do want to ask, before we go into that, a little bit more about the Unitarian Church, just for some of us who don't know too much, and I'm in that group, I don't know too much about it. You left the seminary in Rome you were going to be, again, going to the Catholic priesthood, but then you left the seminary, you eventually went into a career for teaching, and then you eventually moved into Unitarian Church. That sounds like a big switch, and you became a member, it says here, of the Wakefield Unitarian Church, and then you were in America for a little bit, and then you went to be the minister of the church there in Dublin. For those of us who don't know what Unitarianism is, could you tell us just what you believe, what the church is all about? And I guess to get to the nuts and bolts of it, are you a theist?
I think if I can start with what Unitarianism is about. I mean, in America, it's known as Unitarian Universalism and the two churches, which were separate until 1961 when they joined together. So in America, it's Unitarian Universalist. In Britain and Ireland, it's simply Unitarian. And it's if you like, the more radical end of the Reformation, when really people were saying, we don't want to have to believe things that we find incredible. Like, for instance, and this is one of the major controversies that started things off, the Trinity is an absurdity and it is incomprehensible, and we don't really want to have anything to do with that kind of stuff. The idea that Jesus is God and man, again, incomprehensible. Therefore, what happened was people were throwing out these dogmas that had come down throughout, even through the Reformation. I mean, even Luther and Calvin were Trinitarians and so on. But Unitarianism kind of stripped away those dogmas which people were finding incomprehensible and moved more towards, at the time, a kind of biblically based religion, but without dogma and without too much liturgy either. You know, it was a very simplified kind of worship, very wordy. If you go into a Unitarian church, like a Methodist church, the central point is the pulpit. You know, it's where the preaching happens, and preaching was central and is still central to Unitarianism. In Britain, we say that we have three principles: freedom, reason, and tolerance. Now, there'd be many Unitarians who would want to quibble about these, and I might too, but, you know, for the sake of argument and simplicity, we believe that people should be free and under no coercion in religious matters whatsoever. That reason should play a part in our religious life. So if something is unreasonable, then we cannot accept it. And, you know, I mean, really, even if it offends against common sense, we cannot accept that. And tolerance, insofar as we do not believe, or we do believe that other people and other traditions have got many things which are worthwhile, and therefore we have to be prepared to accept those things and to tolerate a person from another tradition insofar as it is possible to do so. So those are the kind of principles on which Unitarianism has been based here in Britain, and still is to some extent. And it's a struggle, mind you, really, Tim. You know, it's because there are certain things we cannot tolerate. And try as we may, for instance, I would think evangelical Protestantism is not an easy thing to incorporate into our particular kind of outlook. Whereas things like Sufism within Islam or the Kabbalah in Judaism perhaps are easier for us to assimilate, because those themselves are not dogmatic,
right,
in their presentation. So we get along with lots of different groups. And in Ireland, I had good relations with the Catholic Church and the Unitarian Church in Dublin and in Cork have good relations with the Catholic Church now. So, you know, we share each other's premises, or we did it, until lockdown prevented that. But
so would you call yourself a theist at this point, in the way that they would?
Again, one of the difficulties with Unitarianism is, one of the odd things about it is it contains many people who are atheists and who would declare themselves to be atheists. And one of the most successful churches in Britain at the moment is Newington Green in London. And the minister there, Andy Pakula, is an atheist. And they don't call it the atheist church, but they call it a church for people without religion or whatever. It's really weird. So you get within Unitarianism in Britain, and to some extent in America as well, you get the whole spectrum. And there are within Britain and British Unitarianism, you will find conventional theists and even Trinitarian theists, And then at the other end, you've got atheists. So it's it's not easy to keep the whole thing in balance and keep everybody happy,
Yeah.
And what happens in Unitarianism, if a person is interested, they simply can't, well, they can try, go to the nearest church and see if that fits you. But if it doesn't, the thing to do is to go to the one next door or the one down the road or 20 miles away, because you may find one that does fit where you are, or that fits you better than the others. So
where are you personally with theism?
Well, I'm not an atheist. I mean, I certainly, because I think my own view is that atheism's just giving up. You know what I mean? That I feel that my life has taught me in thousands of ways that there are strange things going on, and that if I were to take the Richard Dawkins line and believe that it was all, it all happened by chance or it just came out of nowhere and it's not going anywhere, I think that would be to betray my life experience. I don't believe that that is true. Of course, I have to accept that God is greater than anything that we can try to understand. I'm just trying to think who it was who said, it was a mystic, an English mystic, who said, I'm happy with both statements, there is a God and there is no God. I'm happy with both those statements. I'm happy to say there is a God because I don't believe that my love does not have a focus. I'm happy to believe there is no God because I do not think there's anything I can conceive which can even begin to approach what that deity may be. So
you wouldn't call that deity necessarily Yahweh or Jesus.
No.
Okay.
No, I certainly wouldn't.
Okay.
But I certainly have a sense of there being an intelligence which transcends that what we are normally aware of. That there is behind everything something which is purposeful, and also something which is loving.
Do you think there's an afterlife?
Yes, I do. And again, not because I have any proof, but because, again, I have intimations, things which seem to suggest that there is, yeah. But no more than that. But I can work with that. I can. When I was in York in my student days, we had the principal of the college, Canon Lamb was his name, and he wrote an article for our college magazine, and he was an Anglican priest, and he said something like, "I am persuaded." He was talking about the existence of God. "I am persuaded only just but sufficiently that there is a God." And I've never forgotten that expression, only just but sufficiently. And that's where I stand, really. I don't want to go down the Ricky Gervais line or the Richard Dawkins line or any of those, because I think, and I have atheist friends, but what I feel is that they've given up. They've given up on the exploration. They've come down and said, right, this is where I am now. and there's no point to it all. It came out of nowhere. It's going nowhere. I'm going nowhere. Ultimately, there is no purpose. And anything which seems to suggest otherwise, I'm going to put it in a big dustbin that I call coincidence and leave it there. You know, now I that's a cop out for me.
Well, I can respect that. I will say, just in their defense, because I'm more on their line of thinking. I feel like it's less about giving up and more trying to really embrace reality and see the beauty of it. In other words, if someone were to say, you know, hey, I have this this beautiful experience that I had from maybe taking a drug or some substance, and it's amazing, it's beyond beautiful, and someone says, well, if you take that away, you'll see that there's a different reality. And I think to the person that's on the trip, it would feel like you're taking away the most beautiful experience in the world. Like there's no reason to deprive someone of some experiences that profound and that spiritual, that mystical, that beautiful. And you know, there's people that kind of like in that movie The Matrix, where they said, if you escaped and you could get plugged back in, would you want to? Some people like myself would say absolutely not. Other people would say, well, if there's really nothing more to life than what you're saying, maybe the Matrix is a better way of life, and maybe I would rather get plugged in. So I see both sides of it, but I think I think part of it is just when people, like, I'm sure you've heard that sometimes the strongest atheists are the people that were the strongest in Christianity. And I feel like I'm one of those people where I was so neck deep in it that now that I'm out of it, it just feels like it was such a deception. And not necessarily that the Bible itself was deceptive, but that the way it was presented, the lack of information, even the stuff we're about to go into, the Gospel of Zodiac, people just didn't tell me. They didn't tell me, like I was speaking with you before we started recording about how I'm doing an investigation as to where a lot of the verses of the New Testament were copied from other sources. And people just don't tell you that. They just, I went to Bible college for 4 years. They don't tell you where it's from. And you hear sermons and, devotional books and, Christian camp and blah, blah, blah. And no one ever tells you. And when you get out, you just feel so deceived. And honestly, it takes a while for someone like myself to get back to a point, which is the point we're kind of about to dive into, where you start to appreciate the beauty of the scriptures, not as a Christian would, but to appreciate them from the beauty of, okay, there's some literary and poetic genius in here.
Yeah.
These guys were astrologers, they were poets, they knew other religions like far, far better than I ever could. And they wove it in a way where you can go back to the same text and see more and more and more, not because it's divine, but because they put so much detail into it. But anyway, I digress. But I think the concern from our side of being more of a naturalistic perspective is just that we feel so incredibly deceived by anything more. Like the other side, it's like that expression, give someone an inch, they'll take a mile. I guess it'll be different in Britain, but give someone a millimeter or whatever, they'll take a whole whole lot more than that. It's like, you tell someone it's materialistic, it's naturalistic, and they say, yeah, but there's a little nuance to it. And they go from nuance to whoosh, there's a God and there's an afterlife, there's a heaven, there's a hell. And I feel like that cringe effect of like, oh, I can't get into mysticism because it's going to take it so far. Even if I don't go crazy with it, if I teach my kids it, they're going to, 2 or 3 generations in, after, I'm long gone, they'll take it to fundamentalism again. And I lean more to that. I do feel like I'm more in the Ricky Gervais, Richard Dawkins side, but I understand there's a lot more to this, and I do want to, get into that and see some of the beauty, that is there, that people can still appreciate no matter what you do with it. There is beauty in this book called the Bible.
I like a little 2 words really from Elie Wiesel, the Jewish writer, concentration camp survivor, and he says, whenever I come to a conclusion, I say those 2 most beautiful words in the English language, and yet, there's no God because there's problems in the world and strife and pain, and yet, or there is a God because everything is beautiful, and yet I go with those two words. I think probably that's where I stand. That's my theist, atheist kind of boundary line. It's between the two.
It's a mystery.
So
yeah, it leaves the beauty of the life and the mystery, the what ifs. I can see how people too go when it's just cold, calculated, chloroform catalog. It takes away, for some people, the beauty of life, and I definitely don't want to ever do that. I don't want life to seem like it's just a sterile laboratory. I do think that for me too, and this is, I don't want to take us too far away from the Zodiac book, but I do think too the whole thing of evolution. I know there are people, Christians included, certainly, but even non-Christians who would question whether evolution happened the way scientists describe it. I do think it's probably pretty close to what actually happened, with things having a common ancestry. But it does bring up the question of at what point does spirituality become real? In other words, if there is an afterlife, do the Neanderthals get in? Do the people that were before the Neanderthals get in? Do the monkeys that were halfway between the monkeys, so the apes and the Neanderthals, they get in? Do reptiles get in? I think it brings up a lot of questions that I'd want to dive into philosophically, and I'm not sure how I'd ever get past some of those, because it feels like it's got to be one or the other. But anyway, you know what I'm saying?
There's 4 kids to raise, Tim, and
exactly.
That's more important in one sense than answering those kind of questions. And in fact, the actual raising of them will answer those questions for you, and in their own way, the answers will come to you. I would imagine, anyway. Either rejecting or accepting or whatever. And they'll change on the way. You're only a young man. You've a long way to go, and you should expect all kinds of changes to occur in your way of thinking, and sometimes to go back where you were, and then all that's a possibility. And I'm now, having rejected Catholicism, there's part of me now that I'm 75 years old. There's part of me really feels drawn in a way that I'm almost suspicious of myself, But I acknowledge that nothing has to be final. Nothing, one does not have to come down firmly. And in the book that I've done on God, there's a chapter on Anthony Flew. Do you know Anthony Flew?
No.
When I was doing philosophy of religion in the seminary, and when I did a degree later, I had to wrestle with the work of Anthony Flew. He was a British philosopher, and he was the leading atheist of the time in the English-speaking world. And his work was really difficult for a theist to refute. Now, about, 14, 15 years ago, he decided that he was no longer an atheist, and that, in fact, he believed that the world could not have come into existence in the way that Dawkins and co. said that it did, and he came down on the side of design. Now, for the world's leading atheist to come down to that conclusion, was really quite astonishing.
It is.
And but of course, it didn't really make the newspapers, because the newspapers are, in Britain anyway, they're all Dawkinsite, and so it didn't get the headlines it deserved. But for this to happen was really quite striking. Now, why I say that is because, in a way, we can expect reversals. We can expect reappraisals of experience and whatever. So,
I'll have to pick up.
You've a long way to go.
Yeah, I'll have to look up some of his work. That sounds interesting. I'd love to hear some of his journey and see what took him back. Do you know, but just off before I dive into your book here, do you know what, with that particular gentleman, if he went back into Christianity or he just went into a general deism?
I know. He became, I suppose, a deist rather than a theist.
Okay.
He had no belief in life after death, no belief in divine revelation, no belief in the divinity of Christ,
Okay.
none of those things. But he just, what he concluded was, you cannot explain the world as simply by talking about chance. You know, it could not have happened that way. And it was DNA, I think, principally DNA, and the implications of that, which finally swayed him. Of course, he was at the time, I think he was like 83 when it happened. And the dig against him was, he's an old man now and he's losing it. You know, he's not got the sharpness and intellect that he had when he was at the height of his atheism. And so maybe, you know, drifting into a kind of vague deism, we can understand it in a man of his years. But
yeah, that sounds like a fascinating journey, though. I mean, I know a lot of people in their 80s that are as sharp as ever. So I wouldn't put that against him. That sounds interesting. I'd like to see more of his journey. So can we go to your book, The Gospel of Zodiac? Bill Darlison wrote this. The subtitle is The Secret Truth About Jesus. There's a lot of people that might watch this, this podcast, this video, and they might have already done a lot of digging into your work. I'm sure, I know a lot of people have. I see some of them posting stuff from you, which is awesome. I see them posting stuff from other people that have done a lot of the heavy lifting in this, such as Acharya, D.M. Murdoch, John Lundwall, a lot of other people, great people that have just laid groundwork upon groundwork for those of us who are more the lay people who are just trying to figure it out. And we certainly, appreciate, we want to say thank you for the groundwork that you did. But there are other people that don't know what this is all about. And before we dive deep into what it's about, I wanted to ask first if you could just help someone that is more of a fundamentalist, literal Christian, that, the earth is 6,000 years old, the Bible's inerrant, every word is true, every story is literal, there was a Noah and an ark and blah, blah, blah. The sun really did stand still for Joshua. There was a talking snake and a talking donkey. It was all real. And it was exquisitely real, and God did this stuff. And just because it's supernatural, there's no reason to discount it. God is a supernatural being, and he did it all. And he did a fantastic job at telling us his story, and our questioning his story is blasphemy, and it's inappropriate. When you have people that grew up in that background, such as myself, stepping aside from it with fresh eyes is very difficult. It's beyond difficult. And for a lot of people, it's not even an option. It's not like, okay, I'll listen for an hour or two and see what I think, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to reject it. The answer is just, I'm not even going to listen. I'm not even going to give you 30 seconds. So there may be people who won't even listen to this, but if they're willing to go this far with this and say, okay, I'm just curious, what is astrotheology, or however you'd call it? What does the gospel have to do with the zodiac? Before you answer that question, how would you advise people to just prepare their minds to open their eyes a little bit in a way that's not threatening, to say, look, I'm about to put some pieces together and show you Jesus is nobody. He's not real. Your faith is in a specter. This is nothing. I want you to, you're not advocating for atheism. You're not advocating for something which is to some people scary. You're just advocating for someone to step back and see a different part of the story. How do you help people that are very hesitant to do that, to kind of prepare and say, okay, let's take a deep breath. What's about to happen?
I think that it is impossible with this particular issue, as with so many, to start with hostility. You know what I mean? Or with ridicule. One cannot and never should ridicule another person's beliefs, because by and large, they've got them from their earliest years and they're part of their fabric. And to attack them is going to have completely the wrong effect as far as one is concerned.
Yeah.
It's always going to make their beliefs stronger. So it can never happen in that kind of way. And it has to be, I suppose, gradual, and it has to be approached in a very cautious way. Now, we're talking astrotheology, if I can just read you a little piece which
Please.
This might go some way to explain what the problem is. I've got the lights really strangely situated here, Tim, but this is an extract from the New York Times, August the 8th, 2008. And it's called Helping the Stars Take Back the Night. And this is the quotation from the article. When the Northridge earthquake knocked out power in Los Angeles in 1994, numerous calls came into emergency centers and even the Griffith Observatory from people who had poured into the streets in the pre-dawn hours. They had looked into the dark sky to see what some anxiously described as a giant silvery cloud over the shaken city. Not to worry, they were assured. It was merely the Milky Way, the vast galaxy that humans once knew so well, until the glare from electric light effectively erased most of it from the urban and near-urban skies. Now, it's a strange thing that people were going out and thought they were seeing a UFO, a vast UFO, but it was the Milky Way.
Mm.
Now, the point I'm making here is we never look at the sky. And if you live in a city, the chances of you ever seeing anything in the sky are about nil, because you keep your eyes forward. You're looking for traffic. You're looking out for things, looking up. And again, I mentioned this, and when my wife and I were in New York, we thought we'd go and look for the Empire State Building. I thought it's bound to be visible from all over the place. It wasn't. You couldn't see it because it was now blocked by everything else, you know.
Mm.
And so how, if you can't see things in the sky and you don't look at the sky, you never even know what the shape of the moon is in the sky. You never find Venus there if you live in New York, or you don't know one star from another. And because of we know nothing about the sky in our contemporary world, how can we expect to be persuaded that the Bible has got some connection with it?
Yes.
If we were more in tune with the vast beauty of the night sky and the movements of the stars and the planets within it, we might have more of an idea. We might be more prone to accept these kind of ideas. But because we never see the sky, or rarely do, it's off limits for us. So that, I think, is one thing really to establish at the beginning.
Yeah, it's a great point. We're such a different culture from the cultures that you're about to talk about of when this stuff started. It's their experience of life was so different.
And yes, and we have not got to assume that people looked at the world in the way that we do, or looked at the sky in the way that we don't. You know, I mean, they saw it. They had no television. They had no mobile phones. That the sky was their great picture book.
Yeah.
And they wove stories around the movements of the stars and the planets.
Hmm.
Now, you know, you go out on a night like tonight. Now it's very dark here, very cloudy and foggy here in my part of England. But on a clear night in early December, I mean, the sky is fantastic. You know, you see Orion there, and Taurus, and Gemini, and Aries, and you see them all there, and you see Sirius, the dog star. And I would say that you can see there 2/3 of the Bible. You know, you can see the whole of what the Exodus means. And it's wonderful. But if a person going out tonight on a clear night, looking into the southern sky in America or Britain, and cannot find Orion and cannot find Sirius, and cannot find Aldebaran in Taurus, we can't even begin our conversation about the Bible and its relationship with the stars. Do you see? So what has to precede it is basic, a basic understanding of the night sky.
Do you find that fascinating, just the irony of how much more we understand about our universe than we ever did before, and yet experientially we understand so much less, partially because of the light that's blocking us from seeing it, but just the way we all sit inside of our houses, and we look at these deep space pictures from the Hubble telescope, but we're so unaware of the sky right above us. And it's true. I'm here just north of Atlanta in the state of Georgia, and I'm not too close to a city, so I have probably reasonably low light pollution. But I know that on the odd occasion in my life when I've been out to the middle of nowhere where there's no lights, for miles, it just pops. I mean, it pops, and it's like a whole different experience of life. And it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. But it's amazing how that dynamic, like we know so much more, but we know so much less at the same time.
It's true. And so I think I would have to approach it in that kind of way with people. Maybe take them out at night and show them these. And this is the time of year when it is probably best, because the night sky is so spectacular. And at first, merely to get the feel of that, and to talk and to think in terms of what our ancestors thousands of years ago would experience from the nighttime sky.
And in zooming in a little bit before we dive all the way in, did you, as you looked, as you began to do your research years ago, and as you got very educated in astrology and astronomy in general, did you find that other cultures besides the cultures that created the Bible, that they were already doing the same exact thing, and that were there some crossovers where maybe some of this, I know we're talking about something that we haven't talked about yet, but we're about to talk about that some of this stuff that with the gospel and the Bible stories being star stories, basically, that there were other groups doing it, and that the Bible, that some of them not only made up those star stories, but actually inherited some of them. Is that part of it at all?
I would think so. And I think particularly the Hindus, and the people from that tradition. It was very strange when I began being interested in astrology in the late 60s, mid 60s, that people would kind of, I'm not talking about religious people particularly, but just ordinary secular folk, looked upon astrology a little bit of amusement, and thinking that I'd lost my mind. But the only people with whom I could have a conversation which did not require them to smile at my ideas were the doctors with whom my wife worked in the hospital, the Hindu doctors. For them, these things were not bizarre. They were aware. They came from a culture in which such things were accepted and acceptable. So I think that Hinduism, and of course Egypt, we have to look to Egypt for so much of this. If our knowledge of Egypt comes only from the Bible, we are poor indeed. We think of them, we have this horrible idea of slaves, Jewish slaves, pulling these great stone blocks, all of which is nonsense. But Cecil B. DeMille has got a lot to answer for, and so we think of it as this dreadful, oppressive society, ruled by tyrants, when in fact it was an incredibly rich and beautiful, diverse and intellectually sound culture that gave so much to the world. So I would think that from the Hindus and from the Egyptians, we do inherit a great deal. But there's one thing I would like to say here, Tim, really. So much of this kind of work deals with provenance. Where's it come from? Where's this story come from? To an extent that I find really rather dispiriting, because it doesn't matter. Shakespeare got his plots from Plutarch. We do not say, Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra, he simply stole that from Plutarch. Anybody who said that is an idiot, because what Shakespeare did with that is something sublime. He took the plot from there, but the play is more than the plot. And it's the same with so much of this thing. This comes from Egypt, therefore we can discount it. No, you can't. It is not the origin of a story, it is the way the story is used, which is significant.
Yeah.
Give you an example. In the Gospel of John, Jesus cleanses the temple right at the very beginning of his ministry. In the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he cleanses the temple at the end. Now, if we are prosaic people, and sadly, so many of us are prosaic, pedestrian people, we say, where did it occur? Was it the beginning? Was it the end? And if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you say he did it twice. He did it once at the beginning, and he did it once. This kind of reasoning, Tim.
Yeah.
Now, the point I want to make is the people who wrote the Gospel of John and then the Synoptic Gospels with their various authors, they were using the same story in a different way. Each of them had a purpose for that particular story. And so they put it where they think it makes the most, it adds to the point that they're making. To ask the simple question, did it occur here or did it occur there, is the most banal question one can ask. We have to ask, why is it being used in this way, at this point? Not where did it come from and when did it occur? These are the most tedious questions one can ask about these stories. Jesus meets the Gerasene demoniac. In Mark, there's one. In Matthew, there's two. How many were there? And here's a discrepancy. Therefore, the Bible's nonsense. Now, the various writers use the story in their own specific and particular way. And it's a stupid, to me anyway, a stupid way of looking at it, simply to ask which is the true one. Goethe wrote a play about Faust. There's also Dr. Faustus in Britain by Marlowe. Now, we say which of these is the correct historically. Neither is historical. These are works of art. These are works of fiction of the most sublime kind. Asking historical questions of these works is foolish. That's the way that I look on these issues.
I completely agree. I think the one caveat I would add for my own experience and people like me, and this is certainly not reflective of everyone, because there's people that have come from a more either liberal Christian background or whatever you call it, progressive, people that have come from a different perspective on the Bible entirely. But for people, and there's a lot of us in the United States like this, where it was literally true. Every word is the word of God. It's inerrant. It's true. It's not a metaphor. It's not an allegory. It's not meant to be seen as a big parable. It's not meant to be seen as poetry only. It's meant to be seen like a literal history. And I think there's a beauty that you're talking about, and that we're starting to dive into here, that I think the literalist fundamentalist Christians like myself before, we can't even begin to hear that. It's like we don't, to use the biblical phrase, we don't have ears to hear. And I think it's almost like you have to do a loop that brings you back to square one. Like you have to exit and then come back with a fresh perspective. Almost like if you were arguing with someone and not getting anywhere, you might have to go, it's getting too heated, step outside, take a nice little walk, cool down, and come back hopefully with a fresh set of eyes. It's almost like you have to do that as a literalist Christian. You have to step away and say, okay, I finally admit it, just like a Christian would say, I'm going to bow my knee to Jesus and repent. I finally bow my knee to reality. This is not history. And you almost have to take that first step and exit and clear your mind a little bit, take some time to kind of, take some deep breaths, realize that it's okay. It's going to be okay that the Bible is not a story, a literal history. And then come back in and say, let's hit the reset button here and let's figure this out. I think when people try to take, and I've kind of done this myself, I would say in part, when you try to just jump from one and say it's not true, to try to embrace the beauty of it, it's very hard because you have that middle ground of but I want to go back to its history. And if it's not history, then it's garbage. And it's like you have to learn to take that second part of that away and say, it's not history, but it's not garbage. It's maybe the interpretation of the literal fundamentalist, that's garbage, yes. The way that you that psychologically abuse children and say, if you don't believe just like me, you're going to burn in hell. If you don't believe in blood magic, you're going to literally burn in hell. That's garbage. But just to step away from it all and say, okay, let's go back and see what were the original people doing. What was the original audience thinking? And also from the perspective of just the levels of meaning, there were probably have always been people from the earliest part. I'm just making an assumption here, but I would think there've been people who very early on thought this probably was history. But there's also the initiate side of it, like the mystery cults. There's the people that are going to go to the deeper levels. And I remember reading some quotes. I don't have them off the top of my head here, but some quotes where people would talk about, for average people, for the hoi polloi, it is a history, and that's good enough for them. But for the people that really want to dive into this, we're going to tell you the real story, and that in huge part goes to astrotheology. And I feel like that I'm learning to get back to that square one where you start to see the beauty of it. And I've even said to people that that are still Christians, I've said, like, I think it's garbage in the sense of the literal fundamentalist perspective, but if you step back from this, there is amazing beauty. Like, you think, how did they weave in other religions? Clearly, they certainly paralleled, other religions and mystery cults. They certainly wove in numerology, gematria, Pythagoreanism. They wove in a bunch of Homeric epics, Greek epics. They wove in the midrash, the rewriting of the stories, with the new Moses, the new Joshua. They certainly wove in a whole bunch of other Greek philosophers. They wove in these intertestamental period books. They wove in Enoch like gangbusters, and a bunch of the other apocryphal books. They did it with all these structures and the chiasms, and this, I can go on and on about what they did, but it's like you step back and you think, it took some crazy cool thinking to even think to do this. And that's where I think when you can kind of get back, you're like, oh, okay. And that's where your eyes, again, to use biblical references, the scales start to fall from your eyes, and you're like, wow, this is a really cool book. It's not divine. This isn't about blood magic and scapegoating and the death cult that I thought it was. But once I step back and see what it really is about, this is actually pretty cool.
On Thursday night, I was watching the television. There was a program on about Vermeer, the artist, and it was introduced by an art historian, and he was talking to the curator of the gallery where these paintings are shown, and a novelist, and I was absolutely blown away by what they were saying. Now, I know a little bit about art appreciation, but it is a little bit. But they showed a picture called The Music Lesson, a painting by Vermeer, 1660 or something. But what they were saying about it was astonishing. Why does he have the light coming this way? And what is the effect of having this man standing at the side of and why is there more of the room shown than of the people? And they had an answer for this, and the answers were just incredibly cogent. And they made me realize that when I look at a painting, I don't see anything, or I didn't, you know.
Yeah.
My wife's a little bit of an art buff, and she's been teaching me a few things over the years. But when you see art critics looking at a painting and showing you, in a sense, how to look and what to look for and what things symbolize, you realize that a painting is not just a photograph of something that just happened to be there. These are carefully constructed. And even the very fact that Vermeer himself never gave this painting a title is significant, because you've got a man there and a woman playing on a harpsichord. Is the man her father? Is he a suitor? Is he her music teacher? We don't know. It could be either of those three. Why is there a violin here? And what, you know, those kind of things. The point I'm making is that when we look at a painting, when we're taught to see a painting and to see symbolism and to see how things hang together, we realize, or we should realize, that when we come to look at a literary production, we should have the same kind of approach.
Yes.
Not, you know, those who see a painting as a photograph are wrong. That is to remove all the richness from what has been achieved here. And it's the same when you take a text. If you simply see it as a kind of rough and ready account of what was happening, you know, this happened, then that happened, then that happened, you're missing the point of what these geniuses did when they put the things together. Now, why I mentioned that, Tim, was because immediately after that program, which blew my mind and made me realize my own kind of incompetence in this area, I watched a program which has been saved on my television for 2 years, called Women in the Bible. And I've been meaning to watch it and never got round to it. But on Thursday night I did. And there were these two academic women, English women, talking about women in the Bible. One of them was Mary Magdalene. Who was she? Where does she come from? Where is Magdalene? And so on. But the other one was about the general status of women in the Gospels, that did women have more of a status than the church has granted them over the years? And what they looked at, and this completely blew my mind, was that little bit in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus sends out the apostles 2 by 2. Now, it occurs in the Gemini section, which is what you'd expect. Gemini is about two-ness, and it occurs right there where it should. But, and I'd never spotted this, in the Greek, it says duo, duo. Jesus sends them out, duo, duo. Now, where have we seen duo, duo before? Oh, yes. In the book of Genesis, chapter 6, Noah, when the animals go into the ark, they go in, and I looked in the Septuagint, there it is, duo, duo. They go in, duo, duo. The apostles are sent out, duo, duo. Now, what this woman was saying was, when they go in the ark, duo, duo is male, female. When Jesus sends the apostles out, is he sending them out, male and female? Because they're using exactly the same expression that is used in Genesis. Now, I thought, this is an incredible find, really. And it's poetic, you see, isn't it? I mean, it's relying, the person who wrote Mark's Gospel is relying on us knowing the Septuagint version of Genesis. And it's a kind of an echo of that. And we have to make something of that. Does it mean that the message was disseminated male and female? Or what is the connection between male and female in this little passage? But that's the work of poetry. You know, that we have to analyze the text in the way that it was written by poets. And when poets write, they don't write like journalists,
Yeah.
or historians. They have a different method and a different agenda. So putting those two things together, watching the thing on Vermeer and which established my own incompetence in this matter, and then finding this little poetic expression in the Gospel of Mark, which I'd missed when I wrote the Gospel and the Zodiac. I should have spotted that, but didn't. And you realize that if somebody is going to come to an appreciation of the Gospels or the Bible in general, what I would have to say is, first of all, have a look at the night sky. And secondly, learn some art appreciation. And thirdly, learn how poems work. You know what I mean? That maybe if we had that kind of approach, we would have a chance. But while ever we are starting from an assumption that the Gospels are history of a kind, we're lost. We're completely lost.
Yeah. I think I love too how you put in one of your interviews with Myth Vision, you talked about how we have to step back too from this idea of that if there was a God, that he would choose to write in a book. That there's a side of that we have to admit is a little bit ridiculous, where it's just wide open to interpretation. Like with the poetry is beautiful because it has the depths of what you can perceive, and you go back and get more out of it and get more out of it and learn more and come back and get more out of it. But even though that is an amazing part of this poetry, the idea that people can get so many different things out of it and it means so many different things to so many different people, why would the God of the universe, who wants to distinguish himself from all the fake gods and say, you think I'm like that, or you think God's like that, they're all wrong, and I'm going to be crystal clear, this is what I'm like. I mean, it's kind of a parallel to me of like that Abraham and Isaac story, where Abraham says, I want you to sacrifice him. If you're taking it literally, it's like God says, all these other cultures around you, they're sacrificing their kids to appease their fake pagan gods. So when I finally pick my man and say, Abraham, you're my guy, the first thing I'm going to say to you is, I want you to go kill your son. It like strikes me as like, well, why wouldn't God want to distinguish himself from all those and say, I don't want you to be like them. So what I'm saying is, don't go sacrifice your son. The correct answer is, of course I won't do that, God. The test isn't will you kill him? The test is I will not kill him. And so it's like, why wouldn't God be crystal clear? And it's the same with this idea of a book. Like, why wouldn't God be crystal clear about who he is? And I know people keep on it's like a stumbling block to him, but it's so beautiful, and God's, progressive revelation. He couldn't reveal himself really well back then because people were so thick and scientifically backward. But so he's going to give a little bit, and he's going to let them still have slavery for a while. But eventually, when people kind of evolve and get culturally more sophisticated, then I'll reveal myself more graciously and less psychopathic. And, we'll take away the slavery then, we'll take away the genocide then, and then we'll just be, lovey-dovey. And it's like, your God is so fuzzy, he's so chaotic, he's so unclear. And part of that is just our perception and the way we're raised, is that God had to, for some reason, or chose to describe himself in a book. And specifically a very like one culture, not he didn't go to the Jews first and then intertestamental period, and the next time he comes back he says, let's talk to the Chinese now. It's always to this one culture, this one little group. And I feel like that is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for people too, is to realize that like if you can't get past that, there's just not much more that you can receive.
Well, Tim, that it was estimated in 2009, I think, that there are 20,800 Protestant denominations.
Wow.
Now, if that's an exaggeration, even divide it by 10. No, in fact, is it two? Anyway, whatever it is, it's a vast number of Protestant denominations. Each one, no doubt, saying that we interpret the Bible correctly.
Yep.
You know, that in itself should demonstrate that the idea that a written text can be unequivocal in what it suggests is ludicrous. You know, that going to use to. Oh yes, again looking at the television late one night on the religious channels, and there was one of these programs, The World Tomorrow. I don't know whether you're aware of it.
Sounds familiar.
In the 60s, there used to be a magazine that was free, came every month, called The World Tomorrow, and it was the Worldwide Church of God that published this. But when Armstrong, the man who founded it, died, the whole thing fragmented into numerous sects, and now I think there might be 10, each of which is producing their own magazine, and each of which is claiming to be the ones who faithfully transmit the teachings of their founder. The same thing happened with Mormonism. You know, we tend to think of Mormonism as one thing, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is one thing, but there are many, and I don't know what, 40, 50 different offshoots from it. Each of them claiming that they interpret the Book of Mormon and the Bible in the correct way. Now, what sensible God is going to give a text and say to people, I'm going to put the revelation of myself definitively here? Because whenever you get a text, whatever it might be, you get disagreement. That is the nature of a text. And when you have a translation of a text, even worse, you know, there's going to be disagreement.
Yeah.
So
you add into that the whole, we don't even have the originals. We're just looking at, you know, some of them are fragments that, you know, started, you know, 100 or so years after the originals would have supposedly been created, and multiple versions. You know, it goes endlessly into chaos, really, and it's amazing that people can't see that. It's just such a clear argument against this being a literal history. Well, I have asked you a whole bunch of questions around astrotheology. Could you take us now into the, you know, level one? When you look at the gospel, what do you see? Because other people, you know, you really have to have someone give you a primer. If you don't know what you don't know, you're more, you know, you're just like myself, you're more at a kindergarten level. You need someone to walk you through the first few steps, at least, to kind of even begin to think through this. What does it mean to see the zodiac in the Gospels?
If I can explain here, Tim, a little bit about how I came to this conclusion.
Please.
Myself. I've been teaching in a Catholic school where in Britain, pre-university course in biblical studies. These for people who are between the ages of 16 and 18 who would go on to study in university. And I'd been doing this for 12 years, and the Gospels were my specific area of expertise. And so we read all the Gospels every year, you know, with the different groups. And whenever we come to the bit in Mark's Gospel where Jesus says, go into the city and there you'll see a man carrying a jar of water, go to him. And I used to, because I knew astrology, I used to think, well, this is Aquarius, but why is he here? You know, why does he appear at this point? Because historically it makes no sense. The men carrying jars of water was, you know, just something you would never expect to see. Now, if Jesus is saying to them, there's a man there and you'll recognize him because he's carrying a jar of water, fair enough. But if he's trying to do things clandestinely, as the text seems to imply, then a man carrying a jar of water would be just like somebody dressed like a harlequin. You know, you could not expect to get away with going up to him and talking to him and being unrecognized. So it makes no sense on a historical on a simple historical understanding that Jesus would send them in to meet a man carrying a jar of water. Because this is the pictogram of Aquarius. So it would always flummox me why this character appeared here. And it wasn't until I mentioned this on the Myth Vision interview that I was supervising an examination and the Bible was in front of me. And I started flicking through Mark from the back of the book. And I suddenly realized that all 12 of the zodiac signs were here. They weren't all distinguished by the pictogram in a kind of obvious way. There wasn't a crab, for instance, for Cancer. But when you look, you realize they're there in different kinds of way. So, for instance, Pisces, which is the end, comes after Aquarius. Pisces is about betrayal and dreams and sleep and all the kinds of things that you find in that section where Jesus is condemned to die. And then Aquarius is the man carrying a jar of water. And then Capricorn, which precedes it, is about authority. You know, Capricorn, within astrological thinking, concerns authority, and Saturn is the planet of Capricorn. And there you have Jesus challenging the authority of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and so on. And then before Capricorn comes Sagittarius. And of course, Jesus is riding into Jerusalem, not on a donkey, on a horse. You know, read Mark's text. Don't read what you think should be there. Read what is there. The Greek word is polos, and polos means a horse. So Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a horse, but not only a horse, but a horse on which no one has ever sat. Now that is an unbroken horse, isn't it? It's not a sedate little donkey. It is a bucking bronco. And Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a bucking bronco. Now, this is a very different thing from riding on a donkey, which you get from Matthew's gospel, not from Mark. But a man on a horse is Sagittarius, you know. And then you go back and it's Scorpio and then Virgo, and all the way through you have the zodiacal signs represented in one way or another. And this struck me as a lightning bolt. And then I spent the next few years really just researching that and finding that in fact it was correct, you know, that even the bits that I couldn't fit in the beginning, I found were precisely where they should be. The calming of the storm. Now I thought, this is not Taurus, and I couldn't fit it in with Gemini, and it comes right between the two. But if you read the symbolism of Gemini, if you read the ancient Greek mythology of Gemini and Castor and Pollux, you realize this is precisely where it should be. And these were the confirmatory things to me, the things I couldn't fit and felt were interpolations possibly later, I find were absolutely and precisely where they should be. That Castor and Pollux, the gods of Gemini, were the patrons of seafarers, and people would pray to them when in distress on the sea. And here we have Jesus in the boat with the apostles praying to him when they're in distress on the sea. Do you see? And so it worked precisely and accurately all the way through. So having got to that point, then I had to hone it down and make it, and ask myself, not simply what follows what here, but what is the point? What is being said by means of these stories in the position that they have? That's the significant thing. Take the thing I mentioned earlier about about Jesus riding into Jerusalem on an unbroken horse. Now, symbolically, this is Jesus mastering the turbulent fieriness of the human being. The horse represents that. Now, Jesus riding on that means that he's mastered it in exactly the same way that walking on the water is mastering the emotions, because water symbolizes the emotions. The horse in Mark symbolizes the passions. Jesus riding the horse sedately means mastering the passions. Now, why immediately after does he cleanse the temple? You know, these are juxtaposed. Here he is mastering his passions. Then he goes into the temple and kicks out the money changers. Now, the juxtaposition is real, and it makes a point. That is, that even though you master your passions, there are still things against which you have to protest. You still have to have, if you like, a passionate life. You're in control of them. So Jesus going into the temple, he was not expressing the red mist of uncontrolled rage. He was deliberately doing something which needed to be done. And so the two things juxtaposed in this way make a very significant point. And asking the question, did this occur at the beginning or did it occur at the end, is like about as good as saying, did Shakespeare start writing King Lear on a Tuesday or a Wednesday? You know, it's about as irrelevant. Yeah. And so looking at these stories as poems and asking, what is the author trying to tell me about my spiritual life? Then I realized that what we had here was gold. You know, this was absolutely wonderful stuff. That these little stories, which look like historical incidents, are deliberately contrived to make me think about, and you and everybody else, their own spiritual journey. What do we do about our passions in that area? Do we sublimate them completely? No, we control them, and then we express them when it is appropriate to express them. Yeah. You see? I do. And so the juxtaposition is the significant thing. And you go through all the other stories, and you realize that Mark has put this here and kept that out, and you know, all those different things, because he wants to make points about the spiritual life of every individual, not about this one person, but about everyone. Yeah. Again, you know, take right at the very beginning of the gospel, where Jesus is in the house and they bring a paralytic to him and lower him down through the roof, and Jesus cures him, says, your sins are forgiven. Now, you know, what is this saying to me? What is this saying about my life? And really what it tells me, and other people will get different stuff from this, is that when Jesus says your sins are forgiven, what he's saying is, don't let the past dominate your present. You know, don't be a slave to what has happened. And then what he says to the man, pick up your bed and walk, he's saying that to me as well. You know, you're lying on a bed supported by 4 people and you're paralyzed. And this is what people say, oh, my life, oh, I was so terrible. And I did all these things in the past. And I was, you know, I really, and what Jesus is saying is, look, stop wallowing in your guilt. You're too attached to your guilt. Get over it, get up and get on. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then all the other little miracles that occur around there, the man with the withered hand, you know, here's a person operating on half power. And Jesus is saying, let's start operating on full power now. The leper that is cured in that section, the leper was a dead man in all except the fact that he was still drawing breath, but he was dead. Jesus cures him and takes him out of the living death that he's actually in. Now, all these occur in the Aries section of the gospel, and Aries is about the new life of springtime. And you see how all these kind of things all factor into the way that we're encouraged to look at the stories as new life, not for these people who were around then, but for everybody. For me, I think there is no other book required for my spiritual life than Mark's gospel. None. There's enough there. If that is all I had, it would be enough.
Yeah.
It would teach me how to live my life according to what the authors felt, the school which they belonged to.
When you go through some of that with the Zodiac, and I know you're touching just the very fringe of all that you go into with your books, it reminds me a little bit of a different parallel that might help Christians came from a background like myself to understand. Are you familiar, I'm sure, with C.S. Lewis?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah.
They had, you might know where I'm about to go with this, but he wrote this series of books on Narnia, a fantasy land where the kids go through the closet or through a painting, and they end up in this land of Narnia, and they have to an adventure to go on, learn some lessons, and to bring about the forces of good versus evil. And of course, a lot of it is crafted around C.S. Lewis's Christian background, and the idea that to him, he very much was fully aware of mythology, but he thought that Christianity was the one true mythology. But so he becomes a Christian and begins to use his creative powers to write these books. And as he writes the 7 books of Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, they just blow Christians away, and Christians love them. And that pretty much, it stays like the same story. I mean, Christians had classes on them forever. I was in classes in Bible college about how amazing these books were. And yet, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, some scholar, I think it was from Harvard, but I forget where it was, he writes this book that says these 7 books are about the planets. And all of a sudden you go back into the books, you're like, oh snap, there's planetary stuff in these books. And of course it completely revamps C.S. Lewis studies, because everyone's like, you know what, you're right, it's pretty much clear as day. He's basing these books on the planets. And so it kind of put him into high gear again as to the amazing stuff that C.S. Lewis was doing. But what we're doing is saying that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. But I do want to step back just for one second, because I feel like we're talking about some of the meat, and like if you're building a human body, we're talking about the muscles and the skin and the details, the fine details of the pupils maybe. But I want to craft the skeleton a little bit more. Who's doing this? Like we've kind of talked about, this is what they were doing, this is what they meant. Who is behind this? And when I say who, I don't necessarily mean to imply there's one person. Obviously, there were many people that were probably involved in some of this, and some of it was interpolated, whereas it was added and redacted and so forth. But who is probably from the I know we can't say for sure, but from the best of your understanding, who is behind all this, and what was their relationship to just the whole concept of Jesus as to who he was? What I mean is this: some people have said, and I think they're probably right, especially the more that I read the Book of Enoch, that Jesus began as a completely mythological person. Not mythological in the sense that they thought he was no one. They thought astrologically, astrotheologically, he was somebody up in space. He was one of the angels, one of the archangels. And that there was a bunch of amazing things happening with star stories with him. And that eventually he got put into these historical stories for various reasons, got euhemerized, and that at that point was where it took off. And you got Paul writing at least a portion of the gospel or the epistles that we have for him, and then many decades later you have the gospels to show up, some of them many decades later. And so we've got this Jesus character, and so I kind of want to ask, how does astrotheology relate to what Paul did versus what the gospel writers would have done? Were they trying to do the same thing? Were they on the same team, the same kind of worldview concept? Were they trying to take Paul's astrotheology to the next level? Or were they doing something different with it? And I know a lot of people have talked about that so much of this was probably revolving around the library at Alexandria, Egypt. But like, who do you think is behind this? Because we know that, there were Jewish sects that were heavily into all this stuff. And the New Testament quotes the Apocrypha and Enoch all over the place. I mean, just left and right. It's almost boggling how much they're quoting Enoch and Jubilees and the Apocrypha. And so we know that they're steeped into these intertestamental Jewish books, this Jewish theology. They're steeped in apocalypticism. And all of a sudden, you got this Jesus character come on the scene. Where does he come from? What does Paul have to do with astrotheology? And what are the gospel writers doing with it at that point? And I guess as an implication question, I'm kind of weaving, you can answer these in the order you want to, but like, were the original people probably thinking of Jesus purely as a parable of the stars to do what you're doing with it, what you just said, to take life lessons, or were they seeing him differently originally? Because a lot of the questions come up is with astrotheology from a Christian perspective is, how do you know that's what they were thinking? Like, yeah, there's similarities, but how, like, didn't the original Christians look at this and say, yeah, but when I read Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me and go preach the gospel, they didn't mean dive into star stories and understand them and take some life lessons from them. They meant literally go sell your stuff and go follow Christ, go tell the world that he is the perfect spotless Lamb of God. His blood creates atonement. You need to believe in him and his death and resurrection to be right with God. Like, this was really real to them. And they, that's why, you have people who go out and preach the gospel and spend their whole lives, establishing churches in that first couple hundred years. So it seems like there's like a piece of it that I guess I don't quite have my mind around, that like, I want to understand who's doing this and what their goal was. Does it make sense what I'm asking?
It does, yeah. And in fact, it's a crucial question, I think, really, Tim.
Okay.
I think, again, without some knowledge of astronomy, we can't even begin to approach this, because the Bible, and particularly Genesis and Exodus, show an astronomical phenomenon. It's not an astrological one, but an astronomical phenomenon described in the peculiar kind of narrative terms that the Bible employs, called the precession of the equinoxes. Now, what this means is that because the Earth wobbles on its axis, that at the first day of spring, the background that the sun has against the stars changes ever so slightly. And it takes, I think, it takes something like 21,600 years.
Yeah.
Or 26,000 years. And every one of the zodiacal constellations would be behind the sun on the first day of spring. But every 2,100 years or so, the constellation changes. Now, the human race is about 200,000 years old, and so stargazers have witnessed this happening over the centuries and over the millennia, and they've passed on their knowledge down through these vast time periods. So people would know that on the first day of spring, 4,000 years before the time of Christ, the sun, the background of the constellation against which the sun was Aries. But 2,100 years later, it was Taurus. Oh, sorry. In 4,000 BC, it would be Taurus, and then 2,000 years later, it would be Aries, and then 2,000 years after that, that is the time of Jesus, it would be Pisces. It moves backwards. It's a backwards movement through the constellations of the sky.
And we're about to move into the next one, right?
Well, and now we're on the verge of another one. As they said, we're on the verge of the age of Aquarius. But it's the age of Pisces which is significant from our point of view,
right,
which was around about that time. It was an expectation of a new age that was going to occur. And just as with Moses, when the age of Aries began and the age of Taurus was finished, the age of Aries was beginning, new things were expected of people. A new way of envisioning God, a new way of looking at their own spiritual life. So as that happened under Moses, now at the time of the Passover of the sun into Pisces, new things were to be expected once again. A new way perhaps of looking at God, maybe, And so people were aware of this. And in the mystery schools of Judaism principally, they weren't all literalist Jews. In fact, the Jews are far less literalist, I think, than Christians are. And even at the time of Jesus, similarly. So people were expecting something. They were expecting a new era, a new age to happen. And it would be concerning, just as the age of Moses and Aries concerned the things of Aries, that is like the ram and the lamb in their symbolism, so the new age would concern the things of Pisces, namely fish. And so who can read the Gospels and not detect fishy stuff there? There are something like 28 fish references in the Gospels, nothing in Paul. And this is another thing that perhaps we can examine at some point, maybe not today.
Yeah.
And since a new era was about to happen, people began writing about it. The Gospel of John is, in my view, a meditation on the Passover. There are 3 Passovers in John. Literalists think, that's because Jesus' career lasted 3 years. No. There are 3 Passovers because he has 3 goes at explaining what the Passover is about, what it really means. And it's the Passover now into Pisces, from Aries into Pisces. The Synoptic Gospels had a similar kind of agenda, and they were writing again about the new approach to the spiritual life that comes now that we're in a new age. So it comes out of people who were clued up to the precession of the equinoxes and the understanding of the sky, and they were writing texts which would reflect that, and which would give their members, their devotees, something to use on their spiritual journey.
Where do you think the Jesus character first came into the story? Who do you think came up with him?
Jesus, it was just a sort of name that everybody had. You know what I mean?
Not as much the name, but just the concept that there was there's what made them feel the need to start to put it into. Maybe I'm implying something here that I shouldn't, but what made them try to put it into history, or were they trying to put it? Do you think when they took Paul?
I don't think they were. And you see again, because I read the Bible every year, I like a bit of variety, and this year I've read it in French. So, with a dictionary, and the Bible anyway, and so reading it's not that difficult. But I find, here we are. Yes, they're mistranslating again. And right at the end of Matthew's Gospel, in the King James Version, it says, "I am with you until the end of the world," in the King James Version. In this French version, similarly, "La fin du monde," the end of the world. Now, the Greek doesn't say the end of the world. The Greek says the end of the age. Now, that's a different thing.
Yes.
You see
Very
what I mean?
different.
But here's this French translator who thinks that is an acceptable translation, just as the King James man thought that was unacceptable. But it's not. The gospel deals with an age, and it's the age of the fish and the age of Pisces, and that will come to an end, and a new one will take over. Now, where is Nazareth? You know, nobody's ever found Nazareth. Where is it? You would expect, wouldn't you, that a place as important to Christians as Nazareth is would be found and would be findable, but it isn't. But Nazareth is very, very close to the Hebrew word Mazaroth. And Mazaroth means zodiac.
Nice.
Now, that's curious, isn't it? Jesus from the zodiac. Where, if you were to say to Jesus, where are you from? John's gospel. Where are you from? I'm from up above, says Jesus. Now, if he's from up above, if he's from the sky, if God's house has many mansions, what is he talking about here? Well, where, the first part of the Gospel of John, where are you staying, say the apostles to him? Come and see, says Jesus. Now, this is a ludicrous conversation taken as purely historical. Where are you staying? Which hotel are you in, Jesus? That kind of stuff. Oh, I'll show you. No, what's your stopping place is what they're asking him. And later on, Jesus talks about his Father's house having many stopping places. Yes, it has 12. It has 12, each one a constellation of the sky. And I am in one of them. And I'm going to show you what it is. And that's what this gospel is about, showing you the nature of the stopping place that I am in now, which is Pisces. And so the whole of the gospel then is about what this means. Now, this is completely at variance with the kind of interpretation that we've had from people who would make it into history. But we are duty bound to use our intelligence on these things. And
could I ask just, do you think the Apostle Paul was seeing this stuff? Like, how does he relate to this? Because it seems like his stuff is much less astrotheological, if you know what I mean. And
I do.
He's obviously not telling stories. Like, do you think he was trying to approach astrotheology from a different perspective, or how do you think he plays into?
Because he's waiting for the end of the world.
Okay.
You know what I mean? The reason why they translate the gospel stuff as the end of the world is because of the influence of Paul on the translator, not on the writer of the gospel.
Right.
So Paul knows nothing about the precession of the equinoxes. He's waiting for Jesus to come back. Now, that is not what is anticipated in the Gospel of John, say, because Jesus is not coming back. There will be another person, like Moses says, God will send someone like me and follow him, says Moses in the Pentateuch. And someone like Jesus will come at the end of the age of Pisces and into the age of Aquarius, and things will change again. But Paul knows nothing of this stuff. And so Paul is talking about the end of the world and Jesus coming back and everybody go, the rapture occurring and so on. That's pure Pauline. That's nothing to do with the Gospels. Nothing. I mean, you'll find nothing about that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So Paul probably didn't think of Jesus as a historical man. Where do you think, do you have any best guesses as to where the Jesus story came from? Because obviously Paul's describing, he's talking about his visions, but he's talking about, what Jesus did. A lot of people think that, and I'm coming to kind of feel, similarly, that a lot of it was related to, again, the book of Enoch, where you have these archangels and, the ascension of Isaiah as well. But, Jesus may have been crucified in heaven. And that it almost sounds like they're potentially taking this angelology mixed with the Enochian cosmology, and they're weaving these amazing stories of the angels, and certainly the demons, the Nephilim, the fallen angels, all this amazing history of what the Jews thought had actually happened that had caused the world to be in such chaos and sin, and that you have this archangel, Jesus, crucified up in space, potentially, thinking of Richard Carrier's work. Do you think Paul saw it that way, or where do you think just the Jesus concept came from for Paul, and do you think that he was trying to see it the way the gospel writers were seeing it, in the sense of, Jesus is about teaching you how to live, how to be spiritual, how to learn the life lessons that would make you feel, either close to God, or like you're living a life that's reflective of spiritual principles. It seems like the Gospels are more trying to bring you along, to say, come on, let us guide you in how to live your life, how to think correctly. Whereas Paul seems like it's about Jesus, it's the gospel. I preached him. Let's all do it. Let's all preach the gospel. And it just feels like Paul's such a different character in this. Like, where do you think Jesus, what did Jesus mean to Paul? Do you have any guesses?
I've looked at the various theories on this, and I've not come to any conclusion really,
Okay.
Tim, because my concern is with the Gospels, and it's only recently, I suppose, that I've realized that there is a disconnect between Paul and the Gospel writer, and the idea that of a rapture and of the end and of the winding up, what you find in Thessalonians, that Jesus will appear in the clouds and all the chosen will go up to meet him. That's nothing to do with what we find in the Gospels. Nothing.
Yeah.
And it comes from a different tradition, and to my understanding, a much less acceptable one. I don't accept that kind of cosmology that Paul expresses there. And while there are some sublime bits in Paul, there's no question of that. I wouldn't follow him. I don't. If I follow anybody in the New Testament, or anything in the New Testament, it's the Gospels, really.
Yeah. You bring up too a good point of there's a divergence there too. Like these may have been competing sects where we're not getting, this isn't like everything the Essenes wrote is what we got in the New Testament. Like, this may have been different sects. People, like Paul even says that, some people say, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow Christ. You have different sects, different communities, people perhaps in, Qumran and other places, but, all these different groups, and some of them are very divergent. And you even see it within this text, like in Galatians, Paul and Peter are obviously fighting. Paul even says, if you don't preach the free gospel of grace, let it be anathema. And it's like a little dig, like, hey, Peter, you're going to get cut off here if you don't get in line. And it's like, you can see that just, the fights, and even the argument fights where it's not people's names, but just the arguments of, hey, women need to, stay quiet in church, but they're also deaconesses, and it's like, you shouldn't eat meat to idols, but it's nothing. But if you do it, you're doing the work of demons. It's like, well, which one is it? And it's like, you can see arguments within the text almost, and it might be more that, the reason that Paul, it doesn't seem as astrotheological, is because he is from a different group that isn't necessarily arguing the same way. Maybe some of them do have that, but some of them are taking it a different path. But then a lot of other groups are, and obviously you mentioned in your book about Moses that whoever wrote the Old Testament was heavily steeped in astrotheology. So maybe some of those groups that are more in the Old Testament, I'm just theorizing here, but maybe some of them are more involved with some of the Gospels because they keep on bringing back to the star stories. Let's stop talking about the theology and let's get to the star stories. And it's like, it's almost two like different kind, you might go to a literature class and someone says, we're going to talk about poetry this month, but then next month we're going to talk about, something that's not poetry. And it's like, well, which one is better? Well, obviously people argue poetry is the best, but in the sense of like, well, we're just, there's different kinds of approaches to way to get your point across. Maybe a poem is the best in this case, maybe for this one it's not. Maybe it needs to be more of a story, like a Shakespearean story, and with the non-poetic parts where it's like, there's different ways to approach this and to tell the story. And it's like you can I almost cringe when I hear Christians try to harmonize it. I'm like we know that there were different Christian sects arguing heavily at that time, and a lot of different books, even not like we're talking about it as if we're saying the gospel and the zodiac, but I'm sorry, the zodiac within the gospel. But it's like, well, which gospels are we talking about? We're focusing on the first, the four that were canonized, but there was like over 40 gospels, and I admit my ignorance here. I would assume that some of this stuff gets repeated conceptually in some of the other gospels. Maybe that'd be a good question here to ask you. Do you have any knowledge of the other gospels and if they do anything similar?
I don't. I had a friend in Dublin who was really very, who knew a great deal about these other gospels, but they all seem to me to be later, considerably later, and to that extent not to have the same kind of importance as the canonical gospels have.
Yeah.
But I do feel that what preceded the three synoptic gospels was a text that was even more astrological than any of the ones that we present. There's only Mark follows the astrological, the zodiacal scheme, only Mark. The others begin with the Virgin, and you can't, you can't fit that into Aries. That has to be Virgo, and right. So only Mark follows the zodiacal sequence. But there are points, and this, if I had the energy and if I was young enough, I might pursue this. But there are points in the Gospel of Matthew where Matthew is more zodiacal than Mark when he tells the same story. For instance, the one I mentioned a long time ago here, with the Gerasene demoniac. In Mark there's only one demoniac, and this is in the Gemini section. In Matthew's telling of the story, he has two demoniacs, which is, if you like, more appropriate to the Markan story. In a way, if Mark had two demoniacs, the whole section would be even more Geminian. Do you see?
Yeah.
But Matthew has that, but Mark does not, and we have to ask why the difference. And these are creative questions, really. But it does seem to imply that there was a version which was perhaps more zodiacal than the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah.
And so the connection between Mark and Matthew, particularly, has to be investigated. And another thing, for instance, one of the most important books, and I came across this in San Francisco in 1990 in a Christian bookshop, as it happened. Star Names, Their Law and Meaning. This was a second-hand book that I picked up there by this man, Richard Hinckley Allen. And he talks about the Pleiades, which is a little grouping of stars in Taurus. And throughout the ages and throughout the world, these stars have been called a hen with her chickens. You find it everywhere. Now, he's not talking about the Gospels in this.
Right.
He's just talking about the constellation. Now, awesome. Anybody who reads the Gospels will think, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you know what I mean? I've wanted, how have I wanted? And yet you would not. Now this is a specific image, isn't it? You know, it's not something you're going to expect to find, and yet it is an absolute precise description of this part of the constellation Taurus.
Hmm.
Now,
That's awesome.
it's in Matthew and it's in Luke, but it's not in Mark.
Hmm.
You see, now, if Mark had put it in the Taurus section, that would have been really, make it even more Taurian than it is. But it's not there, but it's in Luke and Matthew.
Do you think it's like they're just trying to enrich, like take what Mark did and just kind of make a better version of it?
No,
Maybe.
because they don't keep the same order. You see what I mean?
Okay.
Because it's not in the same order. It's not in a zodiac. Neither Matthew nor Luke want a zodiacal order. They put the stories in all kinds of other ways for their own reason.
Right.
But Mark could have been even more zodiacal if he had used that expression, but he doesn't. Now, I don't know why, but he doesn't need to. I mean, the Taurus section is clearly Taurus without that, but it would have been even more Taurus with it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so, but it's there in the other two. So they would hardly have added it.
Yeah.
You know, so are all these stories from a kind of earlier text, which all three of the synoptic writers drew upon? Really, I don't know the answer, but I don't think the way in which it's being approached now in the universities and seminaries even approaches that question, really.
Yeah.
You know,
I was going to ask you about that. It seems like, I mean, I don't know if you've heard other people say this, but it seems like the more you dive into it, the more you see, in the sense of, I feel like I see astrotheology more and more. I feel like I see it everywhere. Did you ever see that movie, The Sixth Sense, where the little boy sees ghosts?
yeah.
And he's talking to Bruce Willis, and he's like, I see dead people everywhere. I feel like I'm saying that like about astrotheology. Like I just feel like I see it everywhere now. And it's all over the place. But I feel like it's so bizarre to see really supposedly scholarly groups of people completely ignoring it. And it almost feels like, I mean, I'm not into conspiracy theories in any way, but it almost feels like there's some kind of pressure to just like ignore this, like not fight against it, just ignore it as if it never happened. And it's really bizarre. And I do want to ask too, I've got another, I've got a person that is also really big into this that I've asked on, and there's been the thought of that there's a lot of pressure and almost threats against people who talk about this. And I wanted to ask, have you had threats at all? Has anyone ever been upset at you and felt like you're trying to actually undermine Western civilization by redefining what's going on in the Gospels?
I once gave a lecture in a Unitarian church in Bolton in Lancashire in England, and on the outside of the church they had. I was doing the service that Sunday morning, and then I was staying over, and in the afternoon I was giving a lecture on the Gospel and the Zodiac. And a letter appeared through the letterbox, and this person had said, you know, what you are dealing with here is Satanism, and you know that sort of thing. And if you need any help, you know, come to me, and I'll, whatever it was. But I still probably have this somewhere, but that's the only thing that is, and I'm really disappointed that that's the only thing that's ever come my way, really.
Yeah.
Tim. But I mean, people generally are indifferent. You know, I mean, that's the real problem.
Yeah.
I picked up a book called The Gospels and the Synoptic Problem. It was going cheap. I can see it up here. Jesus, Mark, and Q, it's called, and it's a series of scholarly essays. And I thought, oh, this will be interesting. It's all very densely written and so on. So I picked it up and I looked in the back. I thought, I'll just have a look. Zodiac, astrology, nothing, nothing, absolutely nothing. And this is a modern book. This is recent.
Yeah.
But there's nothing here. And
It's like they're intent on reading it as history. Like they have to find it make sense through a historical grid, and yet it doesn't make sense if there's not just the discrepancy issue, but just so many other pieces that are clearly there. Like you have to put blinders on and just ignore them. And I think that's what frustrates me about what I came from, the literal fundamentalist Christianity, is it's kind of like the historicity of Jesus issue. People just have a party line that they feel like they just have to, whether it's for a job or because of their own personal beliefs, they have to toe the line. And it's very frustrating, honestly, when you look at it. Like, there's so much more here, not just in the sense of like, why won't you look at the other arguments, the other side of the coin, but just it's like they're missing the beauty of the richness of it. I do want to ask, is kind of and I feel like I've got about 50 other questions at the moment, and I think I've got another couple dozen that have added on in this interview that I'll have to go back to our interview and write them down. But I wanted to ask, just to wrap up by talking about the early Christianity. How do you think it happened where they switched from this astrotheological perspective to a more literalist perspective? Because obviously at some point it seems like it died out, and it's much more, I mean, at this point, and it's almost like it's fringe, which is weird to think about, but it's like it's fringe to think of these as star stories. But like, do you think the early Christians saw it? Because I read some of the stuff from early Christianity, the first 100 years or so, some of the church fathers, and they talked a lot about, like they had a tremendous respect for the book of Enoch, which is hugely angelic about this angel cosmology. A lot of them talked about how they saw some of the mystery cult things that they were doing as completely parallel to some of the other mystery cults. And they're like, yeah, like, why are you attacking us for what we believe as Christians? Because we're saying the same things you guys are saying as in your mystery cult. So what's the deal? Why are you so upset at us? So like, they're saying we're part of you. We're doing the mystery cult stuff. We're doing the angelology, the cosmology of Enoch. And yet at some point it seems to have drifted to, this is Jesus who walked, meek and mild on the hills of Galilee, preached his sermons. Do you have any idea and understanding of how this began to step away from?
I don't really, Tim, except to say that one of the things which really struck me when I told you how I got the initial feeling for the zodiac in the Gospel of Mark. But then my wife and I came to live in America. She was working as a nurse and I was doing the housework. It was not that there was much to do, so it left me plenty of time. And so I investigated the whole thing. And I came, picking up various books and so on. And what I found was that everything I seemed to come across substantiated my initial feeling. And one of the things I came across was a book which was written, and I now have a copy of it in a reprint form. It was written by the Anglican Archbishop of Quebec in the 1950s, called Philip Carrington. Now he's an Orthodox churchman, and he's writing about the origin of the Gospel of Mark. And he quotes, and I'd never seen this quote before, a Gnostic writer called Valentinus from the middle of the 2nd century. And Valentinus says that the Gospel of Mark follows is based around the signs of the zodiac and follows the zodiac from Aries to Pisces. Now, Philip Carrington, the Archbishop of Quebec, actually quotes this thing from Valentinus. So in the middle of the 2nd century, these ideas were current. And then Clement of Alexandria, who would be a little bit later, there's a quotation from him, Carrington doesn't have this, that the journey of the soul is through the 12 signs of the zodiac. Now, Clement of Alexandria is a very, very important church father. So if he can say this, it would mean that in those early centuries, that kind of thinking was around. But you don't build a church on that, and you don't make money out of that, and you don't enslave people's minds with that kind of stuff. You have to do things differently. Now, you see, one of the people who attacked Valentinus was Eusebius, I think is the person who, and they argued, what they were arguing about was the duration of Jesus's ministry. Now, Valentinus said it was 1 year, the zodiacal year, and that's what we find in Mark. Whereas his critics were saying, oh no, it's more than 1 year. In fact, it's many years, and Jesus didn't die until he was in his 50s. This is, how, because he has to represent every stage of life, and so he couldn't die as a relatively young man. Let me just see if I can find this, Tim, because it's crucial, really, and got a whole bunch of stuff here. And so it would appear to me that there was there was this kind of thinking was around at that time, but it got kind of squeezed out to the point now that you have people who simply ignore it. Who I've mentioned before. I went to see the professor of New Testament studies at one of the major universities in Britain, and put my theory on Mark to him, and he simply said, I can't comment because I don't know anything about astrology. Now, that is a really curious thing for a person to say when the ancient world was absolutely steeped in astrology. Yeah. And to say you know nothing about it is really...
And rule number one when you get to Bible college to be a minister is learn the context of the verses you're about to preach on. Get the context. There's it there for, what is it there for? Like what's, and it's like, it's like they're learning the context of this little verse in the midst of this, 3 or 4 verses, and then the bigger section of the chapter, and then of the whole book. But it's like, there's a meta context, a much bigger context. And whether you're talking about apocalypticism or you're talking about the angelology and cosmology, but astrotheology is a huge part of the context. And for people who are ministers and students of the Bible to just ignore it is like it's just mind-boggling. Like what are they educating you on then? And I can answer the question because I went through it myself at Bible college, but they're basically trying to get you to be able to preach it as if it was a historical book. And it's like if you actually mean it when you say I want to understand who Jesus was, I want to understand the Bible and especially the Gospels, you have to know this stuff.
And if you don't, and if you pursue it simply from the point of view of history, then you're missing out on a great deal. I mean, not only that, you're also making yourself vulnerable to the attacks of the skeptics. People like Richard Dawkins and the rest of them think that the Bible is stupid because it describes things which we know from our own common sense could not have happened. The laws of physics do not allow for a person to walk on the top of water. The laws of physics don't allow that. And yet, preaching the gospel, one has to assume that actually occurred, because Jesus, although a man, wasn't a man like you and me. He had other properties or other things came to his aid and whatever.
Yeah.
I'm looking through here. I think, unfortunately, Tim, I don't know whether we've actually tackled the Gospel of the Zodiac maybe in the way that we should have done, and we might have to meet again and talk about that.
Yeah, well, I would love to, and I feel like this has been good though, because I've had a lot of preliminary questions, almost like a laying the groundwork for it, because I feel like it's such good stuff that, like, but unless you approach it with the right perspective, it's not as useful to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
It's like that, that, again, quoting the Bible, don't cast your pearls before swine. Well, it's almost like, there are some pearls of beauty and amazement in what you're talking about, but unless we come with the right perspective, it's like we're coming as pigs trying to, someone lays before us a beautiful 8-course meal, with just the most exquisite food, and it's like we're coming at it as pigs trying to eat it like it's slop. And I feel like if we can lay some groundwork, it really helps people to think about it. And I know that for people that are in it, their groundwork is already probably long since laid, but for the people that are still in Christianity or that are kind of on the fence, like, I see some discrepancies, but I still think the core gospel's there. Jesus was a man. He was, born of a virgin. He really died and rose again. The resurrection occurred. There's lots of proof for the resurrection. I'm good. The gospel's the core of it, so I'm good. And it's like when you have people from that background, the jump from that to astrotheology is it's like, again, to quote the Bible, there's a huge chasm fixed between them, and they can't cross. And it's like you kind of have to step back and like you said at the beginning, take it slowly. Everyone has time. It took me 43 years to escape what I call the Bible prison. Everyone has a calendar, and like you can't just jump into it. But if you go through it slowly enough, you can begin to have the eyes to see and say, yeah, this is actually really amazing stuff.
Yeah, and that is true. I mean, people think we're denigrating the Bible in some way. We're actually elevating it, I feel,
Yes.
its real status. And when primitive goat herders wrote the Bible for people as simple-minded as themselves, that kind of comment is a terrible disparagement. And I think that people who promote the idea that these are historical events in the teeth of evidence to the contrary, if the book of Exodus tells us that there were 600,000 men, not counting women and children, crossing the Red Sea into out of Egypt, the absurdity of that, when there is no archaeological evidence for that, is to go against that sort of evidence makes one into an idiot.
Yeah.
And one finds oneself, the literalist finds himself or herself up against those problems all the time. And the people who make the accusation are right. It is right. If Dawkins says, where is the evidence that you had 2 million people crossing? Where you'd find something somewhere in that part of and yet you don't find it. So,
yeah.
What are the evidence for the resurrection? All they use, really, it's childish to think that you can find evidence for the resurrection. And what you're using principally are the words of the Bible. Even a child can see the circularity of that kind of reasoning.
Yeah.
And if they say, well, Christianity itself is testimony to the resurrection, there could not have been a Christianity had Jesus not been raised from the dead. This is nonsense, because we have, in full view of ourselves now, we have Mormonism, which is expanding as we speak and based upon the very, very, very questionable origins. And yet there are 15 million Mormons in the world. And there are some very, very powerful Mormon scholars.
Yeah.
They're not fools, the Mormons.
Yeah.
And yet, if you ask a conventional Christian, how do you account for Mormonism's growth? in barely 200 years. I mean, Mormonism is 190 years old, and there are 15 million Mormons in the world. How do you account for that? They would say it's divine intervention. Do you, Mr. Evangelical Christian, think that it's divine intervention? No, no, there are sociological reasons why. Well, why can't there be sociological reasons why Christianity developed in the way that it did? You know, I mean, really, I think it's the closing of the mind that is, to me, the most offensive part of that. And that is, in one sense, what people need to be rescued from, but gently.
Yes,
I think
very gently. I would second that wholeheartedly, both in the sense of people are unwilling to listen to the other side, or give it true credence, where they'll maybe listen to it but not give it credence. You know, where they're saying, well, we're different. We're going to ask for the exception, the logical exception here. Everything else would fall into that category, but we're different. And then just the other part of it is what we talked about at the beginning. Just people that won't even listen. There's some people that they won't even enter into the discussion. They're just like, that's garbage. Jesus is Jesus, and you know, the Bible's the Bible, and my God is on the throne. And it's very frustrating. But I feel like the way you approach it is very gentle. I love what you're doing, and I love the fact that you do give people, you know, kind of that's just that slow story of let's just walk through it carefully. And I'm going to take it upon myself, because the astrotheology is a huge part of my escape from Christianity, from what I call the Bible prison. It wasn't the biggest part, but it was a huge part of it. I want to read your books here in the next couple of weeks, and I'd love to touch base with you again shortly, early next year, and dive into some of the details.
I would certainly like to do that.
Yeah, well, I'm amazed at what your education and what you've been doing here with these books. I'm very excited to the next few steps here in diving into it, and hopefully creating some interviews, some different snippets that help people who are also in a similar journey to understand and kind of pick up on all the insights you've got. So again, thank you so much for being willing to do this. This has been awesome, and I can't wait till the next time.
Thank you, Tim. Good to meet you.
Thank you. Same to you.
Bye.